In this section, I want to spend a few minutes talking about how water is crucial to understanding human development in almost all regions that we'll focus on in this class, as well as connections to various different types of conflict. So let's go ahead and get into that. So water is crucial to economic, social, and cultural development. It is also one of the fundamental development goals. Water can connect through the ability to develop by providing for healthy people, increased prosperity, more equitable societies, as we saw with the Gaza Strip example in a few weeks ago, protected ecosystems and resilient communities, all through protections for various different parts of water provision. Water has been a part of both the Millennium Development Goals that went from 2000 to 2015 and the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015 through to 2030. Millennium Development Goal 7C, the goal was to have, by 2015, the proportion of the population, the world global population, without sustainable, safe drinking water and basic sanitation. This target was met 5 years early, and between 1990 and 2015, 2.6 billion people gained access to improved drinking water sources, from 76% to 91%. However, almost two-thirds of a billion people still are without access to clean, running drinking water. It takes a lot of infrastructure, planning, and maintenance to be able to provide clean drinking water, especially with higher levels of population density. And the Sustainable Development Goals that took over from the Millennium Development Goals in 2015, number 6 is to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. And so you see the difference in the metrics through to 2015 was to have the number of people without access to safe and sustainable drinking water. Now the goal is more ambitious. It's to ensure access to water and sanitation for all. And sanitation is something that we don't spend that much time talking about in this class. The connection to the Gaza Strip example is an exception to that, I think, from a few weeks ago. But the provision of clean water is also a story of sanitation and the ability to take away human waste in a way that prevents cross-contamination with water sources. There are, of course, still problems in the provision of water around the world, and you'll probably not be surprised to learn that the different areas in the world that have been able to provide for these different elements of the Sustainable Development Goal 6 is still imperfect and depends on other issues, most notably resources within the country. Now, connecting to climate change and the other issues we've covered in previous weeks, one estimate is that by 2050, at least 1 in 4 people is likely to live in a country affected by chronic or recurring shortages of fresh water. This is one of those headlines that the readings talk about for this week that make people win Nobel Peace Prizes, talking about the importance of water and resources and climate change leading to the potential for conflict. But the change in the availability of water is something that's going to be with us going forward. I grew up in a place that's going to have chronic water shortages going on into that part of the world. Water scarcity affects 40% of the global population. And over 1.7 billion people are currently living in river basins where water use exceeds recharge. So basically, you can think of water as being a resource either tied up in glaciers and in ice, or in freshwater lakes, or underneath the ground as groundwater. And you can see that over 1.5 billion people, including most of Southern California, are living in areas in which the water is being taken out more quickly than is being replenished. And there's also at least as many people who use a source of drinking water that is fecally contaminated, that there is still a chronic shortage in certain parts of the world to safe ways to get rid of fecal waste that doesn't run the risk of contaminating water sources. and it takes a lot of infrastructure spending and planning to be able to address that. And over almost 2.5 billion people lack access to basic sanitation services like toilets or latrines. So you take a snapshot in time now in 2022, as you can see from the Millennium Development Goals, there's been quite dramatic increase and improvement over time in the provision of sanitary and water services, but we're still nowhere there. And 80% of wastewater is discharged into rivers or seas without any pollution removal, which is just, as someone who comes from a developing country, that is absolutely crazy to me that 80% of wastewater from around the world is just put into our lakes and seas without any pollution removal. However, I remember growing up in Los Angeles, in which we did have storms. Sometimes the storm water would overwhelm the infrastructure capacities, and untreated sewage would end up in the Santa Monica Bay. So it can happen in developed countries. Louisiana, something similar has happened, but in more developing countries, this is more the norm than the exception. The inability to have the infrastructure and the development to be able to provide for one of these most basic things that we take for granted in the developed world. And that's the source from the UN. Other problems dealing with the human security issues that I know some of my students are writing about. Nearly 1,000 children die daily due to water and sanitation-related diarrheal diseases. More than 2 million people overall, both children and adults, die of diarrheal diseases every year. Hydropower, moving on to something not having to directly deal with health, that hydropower is the most widely used source of renewable electricity. In 2011, it was 16% of electricity production. I honestly haven't found a more recent source of data for that. 70% is taken from river, lakes, and aquifers, is used for irrigation rather than for personal consumption, which shows the water, the intensity of agricultural production, which we're going to be talking about next week, is the main source of water usage, often for things that we use 7 times and throw away, as with fast fashion, or we use in producing animal protein that costs 20 times more water to be able to produce the resources per kilo as for beans and grains. And so you see this intensity of irrigation, which we're going to touch on in a second, in Southern California and Central California, where I'm from, but also you can see that in Australia and other developed country parts of the world as well. Floods and other water-related natural disasters, which we're going to be touching on in a few weeks. I wanted to mention here is around 70% of all deaths due to natural disasters. So water is a source of both life and death, depending on the speed in which it arrives or disappears. And the lack of having that adequate water and sanitation I mentioned in the previous slide costs the average sub-Saharan country over 4% of their GDP. So it is an impact that has relevance to the individual level as well as for the national economic level. And in India, it's even higher at 6.4% of Indian GDP is lost, both for economic impacts as well as the cost of inadequate sanitation for people's individual health. So the takeaway is that there's real economic and personal costs for insufficient investment in basic sanitation and water provision. This, of course, is not a new problem, having either not enough or too much. Too much made me think of both the Bangladeshi floods that we talked about in the beginning of the semester, as well as to the biblical flood of Noah's Ark that Noah and everyone on the ship were alone in surviving. But if you go back to water and connect it to the sources of conflict that we've focused on in this class so far, water-related conflicts, the Gleick article for this week talks a lot about examples of water-related conflict going back millennia. This database, the Water Conflict Chronology, if any of you are writing a paper on water resources issues related to development or to conflict, you might want to take a look at this. Their first example goes back to Noah in 3000 BC. Other border disputes and conflicts go back to 2500 BC, so over 4,500 years ago. And just going more recently, water is a related issue to a number of conflicts. I mentioned the Crimean, the dam limiting access to water for Crimea after the Russian soldiers targeted it just in the last couple months. But from Libya to Mexico, Uganda, and the U.S., water is salient in domestic political protests, disagreements, or violence. And I think you could choose a whole bunch of these different examples. I'm going to be talking about Central Asia in a video in just a second, but I wanted to connect it to, again, an experience that means something to me, which I think makes it hopefully more real for you. There's a lot of research on the water wars in Southern California. Not many of my students have ever heard of these water wars in Southern California unless you're a film buff. But basically, the history of development in California is taking water from Northern California, from Owens Lake and Owens Valley up there, and the mountains that get most of the rain in the northern part of the state, and then they've tried to figure out ways to provide it down to where most of the people actually live in Los Angeles. This is also an issue for Las Vegas as well, in which there is insufficient water for the increased number of people who want to live in those parts of the world. And the Colorado River, which is something that goes through the Grand Canyon in Arizona over the border there, repeatedly there's been so much water taken to feed the thirst for water in Las Vegas that not enough of it actually gets down to meet the ocean in Baja California, and the water that flows down to Los Angeles has been an ongoing issue, especially as the water resources become more scarce in the northern part of the state. I have some family that live up in the northern part, right around Lake Oroville, which is often seen in national and international media as an example of water resources being used up. You can see photos online of the lake has basically disappeared. I remember going and visiting my aunt and uncle and going on there. They had a small boat on the lake and having a ball in this huge lake when I was a tiny person. And now basically the lake is almost gone and they have to repeatedly evacuate because of fires. But anyway, the takeaway is that there's been an ongoing tension between the irrigated areas here, in which most of the agricultural production is produced in California. Most of the water does go for irrigation to these areas, but then also a good amount is through aqueducts to Southern California. And one thing I remember going in, whenever I would drive to Northern California, you'd have to pass on this international highway here, the LA aqueduct, in which you have this water being brought from Northern California to Southern California. And then there's also these huge rainwater drainways that you see. In Canberra, we have these really narrow little storm drains. We used to have these humongous, if you've ever seen Terminator 2, a lot of it was filmed in these kind of, Greece, gosh. A lot of movies have been filmed in LA, aqueducts and stormwater drains. My wife always makes fun of the LA River because 90% of the time it's just a creek about a meter wide. But the tensions in California between where the water comes from and where the water goes to has created tensions going back to the time of Charlie Chaplin in the 1920s. Jack Nicholson was in a very famous movie by Polanski, talking about the Owens Valley aqueduct and the Owens Valley Dam, and the tensions and the politics and the high stakes of trying to get water from Northern to Southern California. It's going to be something that's going to see a lot of similarities with the Kyrgyz and the Uzbek examples in just a second. I also wanted to highlight that Southern California is not immune from infrastructure disasters in ways that other developing countries have. This is St. Francis Dam in California in 1926. It ended up bursting in 1928. You can see the before and after there, and it led to well over 200 people dying. You have less cases of dams leading to human destruction as you might in the past, but they are something that are targeted in times of war, as well as for the needing to create resources for economic development. Three Gorges Dam in China being an example of that, in which you have tens of thousands of people being displaced for building a dam that caused some tension. California water war is not something that's gone away. It's still a land grab for areas in which you have current water allocations being limited, constraints on where water can be produced. So this is an ongoing issue in places that are directly relevant to me. In the workshop, I'm definitely interested in hearing examples from you. But that is a couple of reasons I think water matters for economic development, for personal security, for agricultural production, which we're going to focus on next week, as well as for tensions that can escalate to violence, as it did in Los Angeles in the 20s and 30s, and to interstate war, as we're going to see between Chile and Bolivia in just a second. But I'll give you a break here, and we'll come back and start talking about water as it relates to causes of conflict that we've seen so far this term. So let's turn to that now.